long before the rhythms of reggae resonated through the hills, and centuries before Spanish or English flags claimed Jamaica. The island was home to its first people, the Taino. These remarkable inhabitants arrived around 650 CE, journeying across the Caribbean in expertly crafted canoes. Their migration, part of a larger wave of Arawakan-speaking peoples from South America, brought them to this island's fertile lands and bountiful seas. The Taino adapted swiftly, carving out a life in harmony with nature. They established villages, or ukayekes, carefully constructed around central plazas for community gatherings and rituals. Their homes, called bohíos, were built from wood and thatch, blending seamlessly with the lush environment. They farmed cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes in ingenious mounds called conucos, ensuring sustainable yields. Fishing and hunting were integral to their survival, with men skillfully casting nets into the sea and crafting tools from bone and stone. Women were the keepers of the hearth and fields, tending crops, preparing food, and raising children with care and cultural wisdom. Together, they created a thriving society that celebrated balance, cooperation, and respect for the natural world. Beyond their daily lives, the Taino were deeply spiritual. Their belief system revolved around Xaymaca, sacred symbols of the gods, and rituals to honor the spirits of the earth and ancestors. Their leaders, or caciques, acted as both chiefs and spiritual guides, ensuring harmony within their communities. For centuries, the Taino thrived on the island they called Xaymaca, meaning land of wood and water. But their peace and prosperity would soon face unimaginable trials with the arrival of European explorers. Yet, even through adversity, their story endures, a story of resilience, cultural richness, and a legacy that continues to shape the identity of the Caribbean. This is their story, the story of Jamaica's first people, their rise, their trials, and the imprints they left on history. The Taino were a deeply spiritual people, their lives shaped by a profound connection to the natural and supernatural worlds. At the center of their belief system were the Xaymaca, sacred objects crafted from stone, wood, and bone. These artifacts represented their gods, ancestors, and the forces of nature they believed controlled the world around them. Each Xaymaca was unique, holding not just artistic beauty, but deep spiritual significance. They served as mediators between the Taino and their deities, enabling them to seek guidance, protection, and blessings. Central to their pantheon of gods was Yukahu Bagua Maorokoti, the god of cassava and agriculture, a figure who symbolized the source of their sustenance. His name alone reflects the depth of their spirituality, Bagua, meaning the Great Sea, and Maorokoti, denoting a spirit of fertility and creation. Another prominent deity was Atabe, the goddess of fresh water, fertility, and childbirth. Revered for her role in creation and her nurturing connection to rivers and rain, the Taino viewed these gods as vital to their survival, believing their well-being and the bounty of their land depended on maintaining harmony with these divine forces. Rituals were a cornerstone of Taino spirituality. These ceremonies often took place in sacred spaces, like plazas or caves, places imbued with spiritual energy. Guided by caciques, who doubled as both political leaders and spiritual figures, these rituals included offerings of food, tobacco, and crafted goods. Dancing and chanting were common during these events, serving as expressions of gratitude and reverence. The aretos, ceremonial dances, accompanied by the beat of drums and the melody of flutes, were not only acts of worship, but also a way to pass down stories and traditions from one generation to the next. Their spirituality extended beyond gods and rituals. The Taino believed that every element of their world Rivers, mountains, animals, and even the stars was alive and infused with spirit. They practiced animism, seeing themselves as part of a greater whole, where humans were custodians of nature, not its masters. This belief inspired their sustainable practices, such as the way they cultivated crops and used natural resources, always taking only what they needed and ensuring the land remained fertile for future generations. Art was another integral part of their culture, deeply intertwined with their spiritual and daily lives. Petroglyphs, the intricate carvings they left behind on rocks, near rivers and caves, tell a silent story of their beliefs. These carvings often depicted gods, animals, and celestial patterns, serving both as religious symbols and records of their worldview. Taino pottery, beautifully decorated with geometric designs and depictions of spiritual figures, was both functional and an expression of their artistic creativity. These pieces, used in daily life and ceremonial practices, demonstrate the deep connection between their art and their reverence for the divine. Language was yet another rich thread in the tapestry of Taino culture. Their Arawakan tongue was lyrical and descriptive, reflecting their connection to the natural world. Many words from their language have survived, embedded in modern vocabulary. Words like barbacoa, barbecue, hamaca, hammock, canoa, canoe, and manatee, manatee, are just a few examples of how their language continues to influence Caribbean and global cultures today. Even after centuries of colonization and the near erasure of their physical presence, echoes of Taino culture remain deeply embedded in modern Jamaican life. Their reverence for nature finds resonance in Jamaica's rural communities, where traditional healers still use herbs and plants for medicinal purposes, much like the Taino once did. The stories of spirits and ancestors that form the foundation of Jamaican folklore mirror the Taino belief in the interconnectedness of the living and the dead. The island's oral traditions, its respect for natural resources, and its enduring use of Taino words all serve as living reminders of the people who first called this land home. In 1494, a momentous and tragic chapter in the history of the Taino people began. When Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of Jamaica with his fleet, he found an island flourishing with life, teeming with natural resources, and populated by the Taino, the first people to call Jamaica home. These indigenous people, with their warm hospitality and welcoming nature, initially greeted Columbus and his crew with open arms, offering food, water, and gifts. Columbus, impressed by their peaceful disposition, described them as noble, generous, and well-built. In his journals, to the Taino, the Europeans appeared as mere visitors, perhaps travelers like so many who had come before. At first, the exchange between the Taino and the Spanish seemed to be one of mutual curiosity and peaceful trade. The Taino gave Columbus cotton, food, and water, while the Spanish offered beads, trinkets, and tools in return. For the Taino, who had lived in relative isolation from the wider world for centuries, the arrival of these strange men must have been both fascinating and puzzling. Their world, shaped by spirituality, community, and nature, could not have anticipated the violence and devastation soon to come. However, what started as a friendly exchange soon turned dark. The Spanish were not interested in mere trade. They sought riches and resources, especially gold. Columbus, seeing an opportunity to satisfy the demands of the Spanish crown and fund further exploration, quickly began exploiting the Taino people. They were forced to work in gold mines and on plantations, enduring harsh conditions under the watch of Spanish overseers. The Taino, who had thrived in a society based on agricultural practices, were now thrust into a foreign system of exploitation and brutality. The Spaniards imposed a tribute system on the Taino, requiring them to produce gold or food for their colonial masters. If the Taino failed to meet these demands, they were subjected to severe punishment, including beatings, mutilation, and death. The initial kindness and cooperation that marked the early days of the encounter were replaced by fear, cruelty, and oppression. The peaceful Taino were no match for the military might of the Spanish, who had advanced weaponry, armor, and horses. They were forced into a system of forced labor and servitude that drained their strength and decimated their numbers. As the Taino struggled under the yoke of Spanish exploitation, the most devastating blow to their survival came from an invisible enemy: disease. The Taino had no immunity to the illnesses brought by the Europeans, including smallpox, measles, and influenza. The first waves of these diseases struck the island with deadly spot, wiping out entire villages in a matter of weeks. The Taino, who had lived in a world free from such diseases, had no defense against these new afflictions. The mortality rate was catastrophic. It is estimated that within just a few years, the Taino population, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Entire generations were lost in the blink of an eye. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming tragedy, the Taino did not submit without a fight. Resistance came in the form of uprisings led by the caciques, or tribal chiefs, and other Taino leaders who sought to protect their people and their way of life. One of the most famous leaders was Enriquillo, a Taino cacique who led a prolonged revolt against the Spanish in the early 1500s. Enriquillo and his followers took to the mountains of Jamaica, where they waged guerrilla warfare against the Spanish forces. For a time, they managed to maintain their resistance, inflicting significant losses on the Spanish, who were unaccustomed to this kind of fighting. But despite their bravery and determination, the Taino resistance was doomed from the start. The Spanish had superior weaponry, firearms, and horses, while the Taino fought with traditional weapons such as clubs and arrows. The Spanish also used psychological warfare, exploiting divisions among the Taino and using terror to break their will to resist. As the years passed, the Taino warriors began to fall, and the uprisings were eventually crushed. The Spanish systematically hunted down and killed many of the remaining Taino leaders, and the survivors were either forced into labor or driven into the forests, where many perished from disease or starvation. The Taino people, once the proud stewards of the land, were now on the brink of extinction. The combination of warfare, disease, and exploitation shattered their way of life. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and their culture, language, and traditions were suppressed, replaced by the colonial structures of Spanish rule. Yet, the legacy of the Taino did not vanish entirely. In the aftermath of their near extermination, the influence of their culture remained embedded in the Caribbean's identity.